I've often wondered about the types of questions our leaders must ask themselves when an item of business crosses their desks. From their conduct, I imagine questions like the following. How will this make us look in the eyes of the international community? Which wretched attention-seeking minority interest will kick up a stink if we do this or don't do that? Might we get a fairer shake in Hope Not Hate's annual State of Hate report if we bend over backwards to appease the race communists on this question of marginal importance to people who actually care about the country? It's not good enough. One privilege of being a British citizen, I would venture to suggest, should be special access to the privileges of being a British citizen. After decades in which our political class has systematically devalued what it means to belong to Britain, it is high time that we rediscover our right to a national interest, that we unapologetically restore not so much white privilege. I don't know about you, but I have very little appetite for being colonized by Albanians, who seem pretty pasty to me. But British privilege in this island home of ours. If anyone feels disgusted by the fact that the native Anglo-Celtic population of Britain is white, then they, not us, are the ones who should be condemned as ethnocidal, race-obsessed fanatics. But first we have the thorny question of legitimacy. Who rules the United Kingdom? This may seem like a quaint question to ask in an advanced democracy like ours, but the present context makes it unavoidable. To take the most salient issue of our time, a state that continues to import new immigrant voters, not only without the consent of British voters, but in clear defiance of their wishes, as expressed consistently at the ballot box, has ceased to be a democracy. King John and Charles I were innocent cherubs compared to Tony Blair and Boris Johnson. If the choice is between unwelcome taxes or rates of immigration destined on current trends to turn the descendants of the people who built Britain into a minority in their own homeland, I pick the first. Every day of the week, I pick the first. We might actually have the most treacherous elite in world history. In just a few decades, politicians from both parties have subjected Britain to a reckless demographic experiment, importing millions from foreign lands in the belief that these new arrivals would, upon contact with British soil, become upstanding citizens of a multicultural paradise. Now, many of these people, it should be said, make fine neighbors, but even the best among them, understandably given human nature, are inclined to identify more fervently with their ancestral background, whether ethnic, religious, or both, than with the culture of the country in which they have chosen to live. At a scale of millions, intensely felt loyalties to foreign stretches of the map, especially when combined with conflict in those far-flung regions, suddenly make host countries like Britain, with no direct skin in the game, vulnerable to inter-ethnic strife and social chaos. There is nothing at all surprising about any of this. If I moved to Shanghai to work as a taxi driver, it would hardly be child's play for me to shed my Englishness and feel as Han Chinese as my passengers. Even if the authorities were stupid enough, as successive British governments have been, to hand out Chinese passports like stale fortune cookies, it would take at least generations, along with a fair bit of intermarriage, I would suspect, for anyone bearing the name Pitt, which is my surname, in Shanghai to become fully integrated into China. Why should we assume? Why should it even be, there's nothing wrong with this observation at all. We don't need to demonize immigrants in order to recognize the truth of what I'm about to say. Why assume that the reverse task is any easier for masses of immigrants, not just lone individuals settling here? But what have our leaders done in response to the problems they have stored up for us? Well, Rishi Sunak, the latest globalist drone to be handed the keys to number 10, has done more to strengthen Israel's national security in the aftermath of October 7th than he has ever done to strengthen our own. On his orders, spy planes and naval ships were sent immediately to the Mediterranean. Now, in principle, there is nothing necessarily wrong with any of this, but I cannot help noticing that it constitutes a greater show of military force than any of our leaders has managed in the English Channel. Closer to home, where it really matters, the RNLI, which I believe David Starkey mentioned at one point, continues to ferry in invading boats of fighting-age male migrants most days of the week, many of whom, if the exultant cheers for Hamas around migrant camps in Greece on October 7th, I don't know if anyone saw that, but if that tells us anything, are at the very least likely to sympathize with the barbarism visited upon Jews, innocent Jews in Israel last autumn. Nearly half of Muslims living in this country, we recently learned, feel a tribal solidarity with the terrorists who committed those rapes and mass murders. Israel has not only a right but a duty to defend its people, but so too the British government's vow is to protect us. Meanwhile, a recent analysis of Home Office data by the Migration Observatory shows that 61% of migrants who have been refused asylum since 2011 remain in the country. The true figure could be even higher, as it does not include these individuals' partners or children. But Prime Minister Sunak is too busy telling lies about our history to care, too busy retrofitting the past to meet the grubby ideological demands of the present, insisting that diversity built Britain, and celebrating, as he did recently, quote, the multicultural society that we are building together. Now, this is a slightly controversial point, but I'm not above that. A bare minimum of integrating into this country as a second-generation immigrant, I wonder if they're after me right now. A bare minimum of integrating into this country as a second-generation immigrant, I would venture to suggest, is not to impose a propagandistic settler colonialist narrative onto the native culture into which you're supposedly integrating, as Rishi Sunak did. Riding roughshod over the self-determination rights of the host, who never voted to have the world on their doorstep, is not a sign that you've integrated very well, even if you did go to Winchester. The duty of our politicians must be to ensure that blood feuds in foreign lands are not allowed to flare up in Britain's towns and cities. If the tribal passions of certain foreigners are such that they will foment violence here in reaction to conflict thousands of miles away, their contempt for our home should be honoured with immediate deportation. Under a serious government, this would apply not only to those on visas, but to dual nationals as well. There are also worse things that a genuinely patriotic government could do to stand up for British privilege in Britain than take away our adversaries' best-loved legal weapons. Chief among these is the European Convention on Human Rights, frequently used by left-wing lawyers and open borders activists to prevent deportations of illegal immigrants, people whose first act in relation to this country is to break our laws and disrespect our sovereignty. In June 2022, the first and last deportation flight of illegal immigrants to Rwanda was grounded by an interim measure from Strasbourg. The court ruled that the convention rights of the deportees could not be guaranteed away from European soil. Why this implied dig against an African country did not qualify as a grotesque instance of anti-black Eurocentrism for the kind of people who normally care for such asinine language is something of a head-scratcher. But in any case, there was jubilation among all the usual suspects, while the Tory government looked on in helpless puzzlement. Now, tempting though it may be, and I should say that I agreed with basically all of Starkey's speech, tempting though it may be, it is inaccurate to place all the blame, a good amount of it is due, but all the blame on Tony Blair. The Human Rights Act, passed by New Labour in 1998, the year I was born, is quite different from the convention which we signed in 1951. True, the Human Rights Act does now require British courts to take the convention and, crucially, its expanding body of case law, including the absurd legal innovation whereby states are held responsible in advance for what might happen to deportees if they are removed to third countries. It does require British courts to take all of this into account when evaluating the legality of government acts, and they will use all sorts of given the activism of our judiciary, they will use all sorts of interpretive acrobatics to make sure that they can make those two things compatible. But should an irresolvable conflict arise between UK policy and the European Convention on Human Rights, our courts are only empowered by Blair's Human Rights Act to issue a declaration of incompatibility. Parliament is perfectly free to ignore it unless Strasbourg involves itself with a final judgment of the sort outlined in Article 46 of the original convention. Article 46, for those who don't know, is the one that binds signatories to, quote, abide by the final judgment of the court in any case to which they are parties, end quote. The real problem then is Article 46, an obstacle that will continue to harm us and empower our adversaries, even if we throw Blair himself, along with every scrap of paper he ever rammed through Parliament, onto the bonfire. Any future right-wing party worth its salt will have to get over the post-war sentimentality currently keeping the ECHR on life support. That goes for the UN Refugee Convention as well, another child of the 50s, I believe, which should be updated to demand that anyone in need of asylum seeks refuge in their continent of origin, rather than swamping and then shopping around Europe like a geographical buffet. Protecting the peoples of these islands against unarmed conquest by fighting-age males with no right to be here should matter more than any outdated foreign treaty. How is British privilege faring away from the border, in society at large, throughout our institutions? Well, I'm sorry to report, just as badly. The other day, I was struck by a tweet put out by Nazir Afzal, something of a professional grievance monger who we have naturally showered with honours. He was responding to Vaughan Gething becoming First Minister of Wales, and what follows is a direct quotation. Quote, "With Vaughan Gething becoming First Minister of Wales, he said, and Humza Yousaf, First Minister of Scotland, and Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister, and Michelle O'Neill as First Minister in Northern Ireland, there are now no white men leading the countries of the United Kingdom. Representation matters," he added, "actions matter more." Clear proof, if it is still needed at this point, that for these cretins, talk of diversity and representation, his chosen buzzwords, simply means gradual ethnic cleansing of the host population. There is nothing fringe about any of this. It's not a fringe phenomenon at all. Who can forget that we also have a seamlessly integrated Muslim mayor of London, who just happens to plaster the tube with vengeful anti-white poetry? Not to mention a self-described son of the soil of Pakistan running Scotland with a history of talking about native Scots in ways which, if said of Jews, would belong in the filthy pages of Der Stürmer. To repeat, anyone who treats less white as a synonym for progress in Britain should be interpreted as saying that he favours the ethnic cleansing of the native population. Whether he aspires to achieve this through DEI laws and mass immigration, as in Western countries, relatively peaceful Western countries, or through ISIS-style terrorism, as Hamas did and will no doubt continue to attempt in Israel, does not alter the fact that he is a malicious actor. Once seen in this light, seemingly innocuous rhetoric around diversity and inclusion becomes clear for what it is: polite window dressing for ethnic power politics.